Welcome back. Currently, the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. That's both per capita and in actual numbers. But in the last few years, those numbers are starting to decline, and that is by design. Marc Levin is the director for the Center for Effective Justice at the conservative think tank, Texas Public Policy Foundation, and he also heads up the group's Right on Crime initiative. Good to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start right off and just talk about this movement. I mean, your group has been in the thick of things when it comes to reducing the number of those in prison. How did that involvement begin, and why did it begin?
Well, I came on board to start our criminal justice work at the Texas Public Policy Foundation in March of 2005. And I'm happy to say since then our crime rate's gone down 22%, our incarceration rate's down 11%, lowest crime rate since 1968 in Texas. Not all my doing for sure.
But nice coincidence.
Yes,
right?
yes. And so that's been the key, is by showing we can have alternatives like drug courts to hold nonviolent offenders accountable in the community, have them pay restitution, hold a job, support their families, and reserve prison for people that are dangerous, people we're afraid of, not those we're mad at.
You know, I know you testified recently in Congress bringing this message. What was the message that you talked about when you were on Capitol Hill?
Well, I spoke about what we've accomplished in Texas. We've now closed 3 prisons, when back in January of 2007 the projection was we would need to build 17,000 prison beds. And we've strengthened the alternatives to incarceration that do keep families together, put people in the workforce. And so I talked about how Congress needs to look at this as well, as they're considering some changes in sentencing reform and earned time and using risk and needs assessments in the federal prison system. There are now over 200,000 people in the federal prison system.
Let's look at the history of this kind of boom in the incarceration level. You had a very interesting commentary with the headline, "The End of Penal One-Upmanship," and I know it's based on this report out of the National Academies on this boom that started in the 70s. But before we get to what the consequences have been of this boom in incarceration, there was some good that came from it initially?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in Texas, in fact, we had, back in the 70s and early 80s, some murderers and rapists who were being released incredibly early simply because there wasn't any space in the prison system. So, of course, we went from, in 1981, roughly 30,000 prison beds to 2005, 150,000 prison beds, a 6-fold increase. And that was common across the country. It's just it's Texas, so everything's a bigger scale. But what we saw was, although the pendulum needed to swing, it swung too far. And once you sweep nonviolent and low-risk offenders into prison, you reach a point of diminishing returns, where you're actually not getting the same public safety benefit that you could get, let's say, if you spent that dollar on more police or drug courts.
So, the politicians now who are, and I guess during this boom, it was very easy to be a politician to say, okay, I'm tough on crime, let's, have stiffer penalties, let's build more prisons. But politicians are now coming around the other way, you're seeing, right? They're seeing the value in what you're talking about in terms of perhaps, for example, the saving of dollars from the state's budget.
Well, absolutely. And frankly, they're seeing that the research shows if you take somebody who's a first-time low-level drug possession offender who has an addiction, if you put them in a treatment with probation, drug court, they're actually less likely to go into crime in the future than if they went to prison for what would normally be a year or so, just enough time to meet some really bad guys. And then you come out of prison, it's almost impossible to get a job, to get a housing. You're disconnected from your family, your church, and your community. So what we're finding is the one thing prison does well is segregate dangerous people from society for a long period of time. But we're really much better off with continuing to move towards these other approaches when it comes to nonviolent and low-risk offenders.
Now, this national report that you based your commentary on, you also made the point in your commentary, though, that where that report says, we need more social welfare programs in place, not to go too far down that path. Do you want to talk about that? Like, mental health was a key concern for you, right? That's where you think that the state or the federal government needs to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I think one of the things we kind of want to emphasize is there was, in the 60s, you heard a lot about, if it feels good, do it, and society's fault for crime, not the individual, and we really reject those ideas. And I think it's those ideas that conservatives kind of push back against, rightfully so, in the 70s and 80s. And then we saw this pendulum swing, which it needed to swing. We needed some more prisons at that time, but a 6-fold increase, we went somewhat too far. And I guess what we would say is certainly the fact that people are poor, most poor people don't commit crime. So it's not primarily an economic issue. It's primarily dealing with criminogenic attitudes, gangs, so you have negative peers, negative attitudes towards authority. These are the things in certain neighborhoods. There's a real lack of structure. I mean, you have family breakdown. I mean, if you look in the Texas youth lockups, 80% come from single-parent families. So there's a lot of things that contribute that are factors, but we still want to ultimately hold the individual responsible while trying to address these issues. Mental health, absolutely. I mean, we have, for example, the Harris County Jail in Houston, 3,000 people on psychotropic medications. It's the largest mental health facility in Texas. So, and a lot of these people come in for trespassing, for minor offenses. If we could refer them immediately to treatment, it would cost some for that, but that's far less, $340 a day for a severely mentally ill person in a county jail in Texas.
We've got about a minute or so left, so before we head out, look ahead to the next session, and of course we're still in a campaign season, so some of the players are still to be determined, but what are you hopeful for? Because this is an issue that you're seeing both Republicans and Democrats embracing.
Oh, absolutely. I think that we're going to see significant momentum. I'll give you one example, dealing with drug sentencing. Trace cases where you have less than 2/100ths of a gram of a controlled substance, which, by the way, majority of dollar bills have that on it, but that's a felony in Texas, and in many states it's a misdemeanor. And just making that change would, people not have the scarlet letter of a felony on their record and still hold people accountable, but also be able to hopefully get them into treatment and address those issues. But so that's, I think there's a lot of momentum for that. Even many prosecutors are supporting that. And I think the key is we want to make sure in the budget that we continue to strengthen these alternatives to incarceration. And I think we may be able to close some additional prisons. And, the bottom line is we're getting less crime for less dollars. And show me another area of government in Texas where we've gotten these kinds of results.
Marc Levin is with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We appreciate it, and we'll definitely have you back to update us on as we get into the session, get closer to the session.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. When we come back, musician Phil Collins remembers the Alamo in a big way.